The sun hung low over the limestone cliffs of the ancient necropolis, painting the weathered stone in shades of amber and rose. It was the 15th day of Philippi, in the time when the great waters of the Nile had begun their slow retreat, leaving behind the rich, dark soil that would soon birth another harvest. But for Marcus Aurelius, named for the philosopher though born 2 centuries before that emperor would walk the earth, there would be no harvest this year. Perhaps there would be no harvest ever again. The distant thunder that rolled across the Mediterranean was not of the gods' making, but of men and their endless wars. Far to the north, near the Macedonian city of Philippi, the forces of the Second Triumvirate clashed with those who had slain Caesar. Mark Antony and young Octavian commanded legions against Brutus and Cassius, and the reverberations of their conflict had reached even here, to the ancient burial grounds outside Memphis. Marcus pressed his hand against the warm limestone, feeling the day's heat still radiating from its surface. His fingers, stained with the permanent marks of his trade, the deep blue of lapis lazuli, the earthy red of ochre, the black of charcoal, traced the barely visible cartouche of a long-dead priest. He was a Codex painter by training, one of the few who had learned the new art of binding papyrus into books rather than scrolls, decorating them with the images and illuminated letters that made sacred texts come alive. It was a skill learned from his Roman father and refined by his Egyptian mother, a unique blend that had once made him valuable in the houses of the wealthy. Now, it might be the only thing that could save his life. The leather satchel across his shoulder contained all that remained of his workshop, small pots of pigment wrapped carefully in linen, a selection of reed brushes, sheets of papyrus he had managed to save, and most precious of all, 3 partially completed codices that represented months of painstaking work. The texts were religious in nature, copies of ancient Egyptian wisdom merged with newer Greek philosophy, the kind of syncretic works that had become popular in recent decades. If he could finish them, if he could survive long enough to complete the illuminations, they might fetch enough to buy passage on a ship to somewhere safer. But first, he needed shelter. The tomb entrance he had been seeking revealed itself as the last rays of sunlight shifted across the cliff face. It was one of the older ones, from the time of the Middle Kingdom, its entrance partially collapsed and forgotten by grave robbers and priests alike. Marcus had discovered it years ago during his apprenticeship, when his master had sent him to study the ancient painting techniques preserved on tomb walls. He remembered the main chamber had been stable, dry, and surprisingly well preserved. Most importantly, it was hidden from the casual observer, requiring knowledge of a specific path through the rubble to access. As he began the careful descent into the tomb's entrance, the sounds of the outside world, the distant bray of donkeys, the call of birds returning to their roosts, the whisper of wind through the papyrus marshes, gradually faded away. The temperature dropped immediately, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to the cool, constant climate of the underground. His sandaled feet found the familiar worn steps, carved from the living rock over 1,000 years ago. The entrance passage was narrow, forcing him to duck his head and turn sideways in places. The darkness was absolute here, and Marcus paused to retrieve his oil lamp from the satchel. The process of lighting it was deliberate, meditative, a small pile of dried moss as tinder, struck with flint until a spark caught, then carefully transferred to the lamp's wick. The warm, golden light that bloomed pushed back the darkness, revealing walls covered in faded paintings depicting the journey of the deceased through the afterlife. The air in the tomb carried the scent of millennia, dry stone, ancient resins, and something else, something that spoke of time itself. It was not unpleasant, merely old, like opening a chest that had been sealed for generations. As Marcus made his way deeper, his lamp cast dancing shadows that seemed to bring the wall paintings to life. Figures of gods and goddesses appeared to move in the flickering light, Thoth with his ibis head bent over sacred texts, Seshet recording the deeds of mankind, Ta crafting the world with his words. The main chamber opened before him like a sanctuary. It was roughly square, perhaps 20 cubits on each side, with a ceiling that rose to twice his height. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with hieroglyphic texts and elaborate paintings, their colors still vibrant despite the passage of centuries. The ancient artists had used the same pigments Marcus carried in his satchel, minerals and earth that, when properly prepared and applied, could outlast empires. In the center of the chamber stood a stone sarcophagus, its lid long since removed by tomb robbers who had taken whatever treasures had been buried within. But they had left the room otherwise intact, perhaps out of superstitious fear or simple lack of interest in anything that couldn't be easily sold. For Marcus, this abandonment was a blessing. The sarcophagus would serve as a table for his work, its flat top perfect for spreading papyrus. The stone benches along the walls, where priests had once performed rituals, would provide places to sleep and store his supplies. He set his lamp on the sarcophagus and began the process of making the space habitable. First, he needed to ensure he had not disturbed any current inhabitants. Tombs could shelter scorpions, snakes, and bats, all of which could pose dangers to an unprepared visitor. Marcus moved slowly, methodically, using a long reed to probe the darker corners and crevices. He found evidence of past creatures, old snake skins, bat droppings long since dried to dust, but nothing current. The tomb's isolation had kept it free from most wildlife. The next priority was water. Marcus had brought 2 water skins with him, but they would last only a few days if he was careful. He knew from his previous visits that there was a natural seep in one of the side chambers, where groundwater filtered through the limestone created a slow but steady drip. He made his way to the narrow passage that led to this chamber, having to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders. The side chamber was smaller, more roughly hewn, likely a later addition or a natural cave incorporated into the tomb complex. The sound of dripping water was like music to his ears. In the lamplight, he could see the small pool that had formed in a natural depression in the floor, fed by the constant drip from above. The water was clear, filtered through countless yards of limestone, and blessedly cool. Marcus tasted it carefully, slightly mineral, but clean and safe. He filled his water skins and made a mental note to fashion some kind of collection vessel from the pottery shards he had noticed in the main chamber. Returning to the main chamber, Marcus began to establish his living space with the methodical care of someone who understood that survival depended on organization and routine. He chose the northeast corner for sleeping, as it was the driest and most protected from any drafts that might come through the entrance passage. Using his knife, he carefully cleaned the area of debris and dust, then spread his cloak as a ground covering. His single blanket, woven from good Egyptian cotton, would serve as both bedding and, when necessary, a work surface for delicate painting. The southwest corner, being closest to the entrance passage and therefore having the best air circulation, would serve as his cooking area. Not that there would be much cooking. He had brought dried fruits, a small sack of grain, some preserved meat, and hard cheese that would keep for weeks in the cool tomb. But he could make simple porridge, and perhaps, if he was fortunate, trap some of the small desert mice that sometimes found their way into tombs seeking shelter. He arranged stones in a small circle for a controlled fire. Though he would use it sparingly, smoke would need to escape, and too much might attract unwanted attention from the outside. As the evening deepened into night, though in the tomb, the distinction was meaningless, Marcus prepared his first meal in his underground sanctuary. He ground a handful of wheat between two flat stones he had found, the repetitive motion soothing in its simplicity. Mixed with water and a pinch of salt, cooked over a small flame fueled by dried papyrus stems he had gathered before entering the tomb, it made a simple but nourishing porridge. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that his supplies would need to last an unknown duration. The lamp's oil was precious, so Marcus extinguished it after his meal, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. But rather than being frightening, the darkness was comforting, like a blanket drawn over the world. He lay on his makeshift bed, listening to the subtle sounds of the tomb, the occasional drip of water in the distance, the barely perceptible whisper of air moving through ancient passages, the settling of stone that had been expanding and contracting with temperature changes for millennia. In the darkness, he thought about the work ahead. The 3 codices he carried were commissioned pieces, ordered by a wealthy merchant who collected religious and philosophical texts. The first was a copy of the Instructions of Tahotep, an ancient wisdom text that provided guidance on living an ethical life. The second contained selections from the Book of Coming Forth by Day, what later generations would call the Book of the Dead. The third, and most complex, was a syncretic work combining Egyptian religious texts with Greek Stoic philosophy, a reminder that Egypt had been under Greek rule since Alexander's conquest 3 centuries earlier. Each codex required not just copying the text, but illuminating it with images and decorated letters that would help the reader understand and remember the teachings. The work required a steady hand, perfect concentration, and most challenging of all in his current circumstances, good light. He would need to establish a routine that made the most of his limited lamp oil while allowing him to make steady progress on the manuscripts. The first week in the tomb taught Marcus the patterns of survival in his underground sanctuary. Without the sun to mark the passage of time, he created his own rhythm based on the tasks necessary for continued existence. He would wake naturally from sleep, his body seeming to maintain its own mysterious clock, and begin each day with a ritual that connected him to both his Roman and Egyptian heritage. First came the morning ablutions, performed with precious water from the seep. He would clean his face and hands, using sand as the Egyptians did to scrub away dirt when water was too precious to waste. A small bronze mirror, one of his few luxuries, allowed him to maintain his appearance, not from vanity, but from the discipline his Roman father had taught him. Civilization, his father would say, is maintained in the small acts of daily life. After cleaning himself, Marcus would perform a brief meditation, sitting cross-legged before the east wall of the tomb where a beautiful painting of Ra's journey through the underworld reminded him that even the sun god must traverse darkness before being reborn each dawn. He would breathe slowly, counting each breath, centering himself for the day's work ahead. This practice, learned from an old priest in Memphis, helped calm the anxiety that could sometimes rise in his chest like a trapped bird. The morning meal was always the same, a handful of dried dates, a small piece of hard cheese, and water. He had learned to eat slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, making the meal last. This was not just about conservation of supplies, but about mindfulness, about being present in each moment rather than allowing his mind to spiral into worries about the future. With the morning rituals complete, Marcus would light his lamp and begin the day's work. He had fashioned a work surface on top of the sarcophagus using a flat piece of limestone he had found in the tomb. The stone provided a smooth, stable surface for spreading papyrus, and its light color helped reflect the lamp's glow, maximizing the available light. The process of creating an illuminated codex was intricate and demanded patience. First, the papyrus sheets had to be prepared. Marcus had brought several dozen sheets with him, but he treated each one as irreplaceable. Using a smooth stone, he would carefully burnish the surface, removing any rough fibers that might catch the pen or brush. Then, using a straight edge made from a piece of broken pottery and a stylus, he would mark out the guidelines for text and the spaces reserved for illustrations. The text itself was copied using a reed pen, cut fresh each morning from the supply he had brought. The cutting of the pen was a ritual in itself, the reed split precisely, the nib shaped with careful strokes of his knife, the tip tested on a piece of scrap papyrus until it produced lines of exactly the right thickness. The ink was made from lampblack mixed with gum arabic, thinned with water to the perfect consistency. Too thick, and it would clog the pen; too thin, and it would spread uncontrollably through the papyrus fibers. Marcus worked in the hieratic script for the Egyptian texts, the cursive form of hieroglyphics used for religious documents. His hand moved with practiced precision, each character flowing into the next, the columns of text straight and evenly spaced. For the Greek sections, he switched to uncial letters, the formal bookhand that Roman and Greek scribes used for important texts. The shift between scripts required a different rhythm, a different way of holding the pen, but Marcus found the variation helped prevent the cramping that could come from hours of writing in a single style. The illustrations required even more care. The pigments had to be prepared fresh each day, ground on a small palette and mixed with egg white or gum to create paint that would adhere to the papyrus without cracking or flaking. The Egyptian tradition called for flat, symbolic representations, gods and humans shown in profile, their actions clear and unambiguous. But Marcus also incorporated some of the naturalistic techniques he had learned from Greek artists, adding subtle shading and depth that made the figures seem to breathe on the page. The most challenging illustrations were the illuminated capitals that began each section of text. These required the finest brushes, some made from just a few hairs from a cat's ear, and the steadiest hand. Gold leaf, when the patron could afford it, would be applied to certain letters, but Marcus had only a small supply of gold, saved for the most important passages. The process of applying gold leaf required first painting the letter with a special adhesive, then carefully laying the gossamer thin gold onto the surface, burnishing it with a smooth agate until it shone like the sun itself. As he worked, Marcus would often pause to study the tomb paintings around him. The ancient artists had been masters of their craft, and even in this modest tomb, their skill was evident. He observed how they had used overlapping figures to create depth, how they had varied the intensity of colors to suggest distance, how they had used hieroglyphic texts not just as words but as decorative elements integrated into the overall composition. These observations influenced his own work, adding subtle improvements to techniques passed down through generations. The concentration required for such detailed work meant that Marcus could only paint for a few hours at a time before his eyes began to strain and his hand to shake. During these rest periods, he would extinguish the lamp to conserve oil and sit in the darkness, allowing his eyes to recover. Sometimes he would eat a small meal, a handful of grain soaked in water until soft, perhaps with a few drops of oil for flavor. Other times he would simply sit in meditation, listening to the sounds of the tomb and the occasional noise from the world above that filtered down through the rock. The afternoons, though in the tomb's eternal twilight, afternoon was merely a concept, were devoted to the more mundane tasks of survival. Water had to be collected from the seep, a slow process that required patience. Marcus had fashioned a series of vessels from broken pottery, sealing the cracks with beeswax from his supplies. These were positioned under the drip, and over the course of hours, they would fill with the precious liquid. The water then had to be filtered through sand and cloth to remove any sediment, a process his Egyptian mother had taught him was essential for preventing the stomach ailments that could come from drinking impure water. Food preparation, though simple, still required attention. The grain had to be ground daily, as flour would spoil quickly in the tomb's humidity. Marcus had found a proper grinding stone in what appeared to have been a preparation chamber for funeral offerings, and he spent time each day creating enough flour for his meals. Sometimes he would mix the flour with oil and a precious pinch of herbs to create flat breads that he cooked on hot stones placed in his small fire. The smoke was always a concern, but he had discovered that burning dried animal dung, which he had gathered before entering the tomb, produced less smoke than would while still providing adequate heat. One of his most successful adaptations was the creation of a small garden of sprouts. Using some of his grain supply, he would soak the seeds in water until they began to germinate, then spread them on damp cloth in clay dishes. Within days, fresh green shoots would appear, providing essential nutrition that his dried supplies lacked. The sprouts had to be tended carefully, kept moist but not so wet that they would mold, positioned where they would receive the brief periods of reflected sunlight that penetrated the entrance passage during certain hours of the day. As the days passed, Marcus established a routine for maintaining his living space. The tomb, while dry, still accumulated dust and debris. Each morning, he would sweep the floor with a broom made from papyrus fibers, gathering the dust into a corner where it wouldn't interfere with his work. His belongings were organized meticulously, pigments arranged by color, brushes sorted by size, papyrus sheets stacked between boards to keep them flat. This organization was not just practical but psychological, a way of maintaining control and sanity in the isolation. The isolation itself was perhaps the greatest challenge. Marcus had always been comfortable with solitude, his work required it, but the complete separation from human contact was something different. He found himself talking aloud sometimes, commenting on his work or reciting poetry he had memorized. The sound of his own voice echoing off the stone walls was both comforting and unsettling. He began to understand why hermits and anchorites were said to receive visions. The mind, deprived of external stimulation, created its own reality. To combat the mental effects of isolation, Marcus established a routine of physical exercise. In the main chamber, he would perform a series of movements based on the military training his Roman father had insisted upon. Push-ups with his hands on the raised edge of the sarcophagus, squats holding heavy stones, stretches that kept his body limber despite hours hunched over his work. The exercise served multiple purposes. It maintained his physical health, provided a break from the intense concentration of painting, and helped tire him enough to sleep soundly despite the constant darkness. Sleep itself became a carefully managed resource. Without the natural cycle of day and night, Marcus had to impose his own rhythm. He would work by lamplight for specific periods, measured by the burning of marked candles he had made from beeswax and papyrus wicks. When a candle burned down to a certain mark, it was time to rest, regardless of how he felt. This artificial schedule helped prevent the disorientation that could come from living in eternal darkness. Dreams in the tomb were vivid and strange. Sometimes Marcus dreamed of the world above, the sun on his face, the bustle of the Memphis markets, the sound of temple bells calling the faithful to prayer. Other times, his dreams were influenced by the images surrounding him. He would find himself in the afterlife depicted on the walls, his heart being weighed against a feather while Thoth recorded the result. Once, he dreamed that the paintings had come to life, that the gods and goddesses stepped down from the walls to examine his work, nodding their approval or pointing out imperfections with divine fingers. As the second week of his underground exile began, Marcus had settled into a rhythm that felt almost monastic in its regularity. The tomb had transformed from a mere hiding place into a scriptorium, a sanctuary where sacred work continued despite the chaos of the world above. The walls themselves seemed to approve, the ancient paintings watching over his efforts like a congregation of silent witnesses. The work on the first Codex, the Instructions of Taotep, was progressing well. This ancient text, supposedly written by a vizier who had served under King Icesi nearly 2,000 years ago, contained maxims for living a successful and ethical life. Marcus found comfort in copying these timeless words, each one polished by centuries of transmission. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a man is his sword, and speech is stronger than all fighting. As he formed each hieratic character with his reed pen, Marcus contemplated how these words applied to his current situation. Here in the tomb, removed from all conflict, he was wielding the only weapon that truly mattered, the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Each completed page was a small victory against the forces of chaos and destruction that raged in the world above. The illuminations for this text required careful thought. The tradition was to illustrate each maxim with a scene from daily life, but Marcus wanted to do more. He wanted to create images that would speak across time, that would be as relevant to a reader centuries hence as they were to someone in his own day. For the maxim about speech, he painted a scribe at work, but in the background, he added subtle details, a broken sword lying forgotten in the dust, while scrolls and books rose like pillars supporting the sky. His pigments were holding up well, though he had to be increasingly creative in their use. The precious lapis lazuli, imported from distant Afghanistan, he reserved for the most important elements, the clothing of gods, the sky in paradise, the water of life. For other blues, he had to make do with copper-based pigments, heating malachite carefully over his small fire until it transformed into a different shade. The process was delicate. Too much heat and the color would turn black, too little and it would remain green. The red ochre from the Egyptian earth was plentiful in his supplies, but Marcus had discovered that by mixing it with different binding agents, he could achieve various effects. Mixed with egg white, it produced a bright, glossy red suitable for important text. Mixed with plant gum, it became more muted, perfect for skin tones and earthly objects. He had even experimented with mixing it with beeswax, creating a paint that could be burnished to a subtle sheen. For black, he had lampblack in abundance, the soot from his oil lamp carefully collected each day and ground with gum arabic. But he had also discovered that different materials produced different blacks when charred. Papyrus gave a warm black with brown undertones. date pits, when burned and ground, produced a cooler, blue-black. These subtle variations allowed him to create depth and distinction in his illustrations that would have been impossible with a single black pigment. The gold leaf was his most precious resource, and Marcus used it sparingly but effectively. He had developed a technique of applying it in tiny fragments, creating the illusion of more coverage than actually existed. A thin line of gold along the edge of a figure's robe, a few flakes in a crown, the smallest touch on a sacred symbol, these minimal applications caught the light and drew the eye, making the entire page seem more luxurious than it actually was. One morning, or what Marcus had designated as morning in his timeless world, he made a disturbing discovery. The sounds from above, usually limited to the occasional distant voice or the rumble of a cart, had changed. He heard organized movement, the rhythmic tread of many feet, the clatter of metal that could only be weapons. Soldiers were passing near the tomb, perhaps using the old road that ran along the cliff face. Marcus extinguished his lamp immediately and sat in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. The entrance to the tomb was well hidden, but a dedicated search might reveal it. He waited, counting his heartbeats, as the sounds grew closer, peaked, and then gradually faded into the distance. Only after an hour of complete silence did he dare to relight his lamp and return to work. The incident reminded him of the precariousness of his situation. He began to take additional precautions, working only during what he estimated to be night hours when discovery would be less likely. During the day, he would sit in darkness, working by touch on tasks that didn't require sight, grinding pigments, cutting reed pens, preparing papyrus sheets by feel alone. His fingers became increasingly sensitive, able to detect the slightest imperfection in a papyrus surface, the exact consistency of paint, the precise angle of a pen's nib. This enforced darkness led to an unexpected development in his art. Sitting in the absolute blackness, Marcus began to visualize his illustrations with unprecedented clarity. Without the distraction of sight, his mind's eye could conceive compositions of perfect balance and harmony. He would spend hours in the dark, mentally painting entire pages, working out every detail, every color choice, every line. When he finally lit his lamp and put brush to papyrus, the images flowed from his hand as if they had always existed, merely waiting to be revealed. The second Codex, containing selections from the Book of Coming Forth by Day, presented different challenges. This was a magical text, meant to guide the deceased through the perils of the afterlife. The illustrations were not merely decorative but functional. They were believed to have actual power, to be able to assist the soul in its journey. This responsibility weighed heavily on Marcus. A mistake in these images wasn't just an artistic failure, it could, according to belief, doom a soul to eternal wandering. The most important illustration in this codex was the weighing of the heart scene, where the deceased's heart was balanced against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. Marcus spent 3 full days on this single image, working with the finest brushes he had. The scale had to be perfectly balanced, the feather rendered with such delicacy that it seemed to float on the papyrus. Amit, the devourer who waited to consume unworthy hearts, had to be fearsome enough to inspire proper behavior but not so terrifying as to cause despair. As he painted Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, Marcus found himself thinking about his own heart. If it were weighed now, what would the scales show? He had fled rather than fight, chosen preservation over participation. Was this wisdom or cowardice? the ancient texts seem to offer contradictory guidance. Some praised the scribe who avoided conflict to preserve knowledge. Others honored those who stood and fought for what was right. Perhaps, Marcus thought, the truth was that both paths could be righteous, depending on one's calling and circumstances. The tomb itself seemed to be testing him, presenting new challenges as the days passed. A section of ceiling in the side chamber developed a crack, and Marcus spent anxious hours shoring it up with wooden beams salvaged from old funeral furniture. The temperature began to drop as the season advanced, and he had to fashion warmer clothing from his blanket, cutting it carefully to create a crude robe while preserving enough material for sleeping. Most concerning was his food supply. Despite careful rationing, his stores were depleting faster than anticipated. The grain, in particular, was running low. Marcus began to implement even stricter conservation measures. He reduced his meals to twice a day, then to once, supplementing with larger quantities of water to fill his stomach. He experimented with eating papyrus pith, as he had heard the ancient marsh dwellers did during famines. It was bitter and fibrous, but it provided some nutrition and, more importantly, the feeling of fullness. One night, Marcus was awakened by a sound he had never heard in the tomb before, scratching, followed by a high-pitched squeaking. His first thought was that soldiers had found the entrance, but the sound was too small, too organic. Lighting his lamp carefully, he discovered the source. A family of jerboa, the small desert jumping mice, had found their way into the tomb, probably seeking shelter from a sandstorm above. Rather than driving them away, Marcus saw an opportunity. He set up simple traps using pottery shards and grain as bait. The meat they provided was minimal, barely a mouthful per creature, but it was fresh protein, something his body desperately craved. He felt a pang of guilt at taking their lives, but survival demanded such choices. He performed a small ritual for each creature, thanking it for its sacrifice, a practice his Egyptian mother had taught him that honored the connection between all living things. The presence of the jerboa also suggested something else. There must be another entrance to the tomb, something small and hidden that the creatures had discovered. Marcus spent several hours exploring, finally finding a narrow crack in the back wall of a storage chamber. Air flowed through it, fresh air from the outside. The crack was far too small for a person to pass through, but it provided valuable ventilation and, Marcus realized, a potential emergency signaling method if rescue ever became possible. By the third week, the tomb had become Marcus's entire world. The paintings on the walls were no longer decorations but companions, their faces as familiar as old friends. He had given them names, created stories for them beyond what the hieroglyphic texts provided. The image of a young scribe on the north wall he called Thutmosa, imagining him as an apprentice like Marcus had once been, eager but uncertain. A priestess bearing offerings became Nefertiti, not the famous queen, but a humble servant of the gods who took pride in her daily rituals. These imaginary conversations helped maintain his sanity, but they also influenced his work in unexpected ways. As he painted his own figures, he found himself incorporating personality traits he had imagined for the tomb paintings. His illustrations became more nuanced, more human, even as they maintained their sacred function. The third Codex, the syncretic blend of Egyptian and Greek wisdom, was proving to be the most challenging. It required not just copying but actual translation and interpretation. The text attempted to show how the ancient Egyptian concept of ma'at, truth, justice, and cosmic order, aligned with the Greek notion of logos, reason, word, and divine order. Marcus found himself not merely a scribe but a philosopher, working out how to visually represent concepts that existed in the liminal space between two great traditions. For one particularly complex passage comparing the Egyptian journey through the afterlife with the Greek philosophical journey toward enlightenment, Marcus created an innovative illustration. He painted a figure walking a path that wound through the page like the hieroglyph for journey. On one side of the path were Egyptian symbols, the scales of justice, the eye of Horus, the ankh of life. On the other were Greek elements, the owl of Athena, the laurel of Apollo, the labyrinth of self-knowledge. The figure itself was deliberately ambiguous, dressed in garments that could be either Egyptian or Greek, facing forward so that neither profile nor frontal view dominated. His oil supply for the lamp was becoming critically low. Marcus had already begun experimenting with alternative light sources. He discovered that certain fungi growing in the dampest corners of the tomb gave off a faint phosphorescent glow. It wasn't enough to work by, but it provided just enough light to navigate the familiar chambers without using precious oil. He also found that by positioning polished metal surfaces, his bronze mirror and some ancient copper plates he had found, he could reflect and amplify what little light filtered through the entrance during certain times of day. But the most innovative solution came from the ancient texts themselves. In the Book of Coming Forth by Day, there were spells for creating light in the darkness of the underworld. While Marcus didn't believe in the literal magic of the words, he found that the ritual of reciting them, combined with intense visualization, allowed him to work for short periods in near darkness. His hand would remember the shapes of letters, the feel of the brush on papyrus, the rhythm of creation. It wasn't perfect. He would later have to correct mistakes when he could use the lamp, but it allowed him to continue making progress. The water from the seep had begun to taste different, taking on a metallic flavor that concerned Marcus. He suspected that the recent military activity above had somehow affected the groundwater, perhaps from iron weapons or armor left in the earth. He began an elaborate purification process, filtering the water through multiple layers of sand and charcoal, then boiling it over his small fire despite the precious fuel this consumed. He also started collecting the condensation that formed on the tomb walls during the coolest part of the night, a painstaking process that yielded only drops but provided water he knew was pure. His health was beginning to show signs of strain. The restricted diet had caused him to lose weight, his ribs now clearly visible beneath his skin. His gums had begun to bleed, a sign of the saline disease that came from lack of fresh food. Marcus knew he needed to find additional sources of nutrition or risk becoming too weak to complete his work. In desperation, he began to explore deeper sections of the tomb he had previously avoided. These areas were less stable, with partially collapsed ceilings and floors covered in debris. But in one chamber, he made a valuable discovery, a cache of funeral goods that had been overlooked by ancient robbers. Among the pottery and decayed linens, he found several sealed jars containing natron, the salt used in mummification. While not food itself, natron could be used to preserve what little meat he could obtain from the jerboa, extending his protein supply. More valuable still were several jars of honey, crystallized with age but still edible. Honey never spoiled, and these jars, sealed for perhaps 1,000 years, were perfectly preserved. The sweet substance was like ambrosia after weeks of grain and dried fruit. Marcus rationed it carefully, a small spoonful each day dissolved in hot water, creating a tea that provided energy and comfort. In the same chamber, he discovered something that would prove invaluable to his work, a collection of ancient pigments, stored in small alabaster jars and still viable after centuries. The colors were different from his own, made with techniques that had been lost to time. There was a blue that seemed to glow with inner light, a red deeper than blood, a yellow like captured sunshine. Marcus spent days experimenting with these ancient materials, learning their properties, understanding how the old masters had achieved effects he had only dreamed of. The fourth week brought Marcus to the edge of despair. His oil was nearly gone, reduced to perhaps 3 days of light if used sparingly. His food, despite the honey, was running dangerously low. But worst of all, news from above, gathered from overheard conversations of travelers on the road, suggested that the battle at Philippi had ended in victory for the triumvirate. The supporters of the Republic were being hunted down, and anyone associated with them faced death or slavery. Marcus had not been directly involved in the political struggle, but his patrons included several wealthy Republicans. His name would be on lists, his work in their houses remembered. Even if he could leave the tomb, where would he go? The world above had become even more dangerous than when he had fled to this underground sanctuary. In this darkness, both literal and metaphorical, Marcus experienced what mystics would call the dark night of the soul. Sitting in the absolute blackness of the tomb, oil too precious to burn, he confronted the possibility that he would die here, his work unfinished, his body becoming just another mummy in this ancient place of death. But it was in this moment of deepest despair that Marcus experienced a profound realization. The tomb paintings around him, invisible in the darkness but burned into his memory, had been created by artists who knew their work might never be seen. These ancient painters had labored in tombs that would be sealed, creating beauty that was intended not for human eyes but for the gods and the dead. Yet they had poured their entire skill, their complete devotion, into every line and color. Marcus understood then that the value of his work did not depend on whether it would be seen or sold or appreciated. The act of creation itself was sacred, a participation in the divine ordering of chaos into beauty. Whether he lived or died, whether his codices ever left this tomb, he would complete them to the best of his ability, because that was his calling, his contribution to the eternal human effort to preserve and transmit wisdom. With renewed determination, Marcus organized his remaining resources. He had perhaps 50 hours of lamplight left if he was extremely careful. He created a schedule that would allow him to complete the most essential illustrations, leaving text sections that could be finished in darkness or by the faint light that filtered through the entrance. He also began preparing for the possibility that he might not survive. Using some of his precious papyrus, he wrote an account of his time in the tomb, describing his techniques, his discoveries about the ancient pigments, his innovations in working with limited light. If someone found his body and his work years or centuries later, they would understand what had been attempted here. He sealed this account in one of the ancient canopic jars he had found, using beeswax to make it waterproof. The work took on a fever pitch of intensity. Marcus pushed himself to the limits of his endurance, painting for hours until his eyes burned and his hand cramped into a claw. He discovered that by closing his eyes for specific intervals, counted by his heartbeat, he could extend his ability to work in low light. 20 heartbeats with eyes closed, then 10 with eyes open, allowing his vision to remain adjusted to near darkness while still making progress. His illustrations during this period took on a unique quality. Created under extreme duress, they possessed an emotional intensity that his earlier, more comfortable work had lacked. The figures seemed to strain against the boundaries of the papyrus, reaching towards something beyond the material world. The colors, applied with desperate economy, achieved maximum impact with minimal pigment. Every line was essential, every shade necessary. The syncretic Codex, in particular, benefited from this intensity. The marriage of Egyptian and Greek thought was no longer an academic exercise but a lived experience. Marcus was simultaneously the Egyptian scribe preserving ancient wisdom and the Greek philosopher reasoning his way through darkness. The illustrations became visual arguments, each image a thesis about the unity underlying apparent diversity. One painting, which would later be considered his masterpiece though he created it in near darkness with trembling hands, showed the moment of death and transformation. An Egyptian mummy and a Greek philosopher stood on opposite sides of a doorway. Through the doorway, visible to both, was a landscape that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Greek but something new, a garden where lotus flowers grew alongside olive trees, where pyramids and temples stood in harmony, where the sun was both Ra and Apollo. The painting suggested that death was not an ending but a translation, a movement from the particular to the universal. On what Marcus calculated to be the 32nd day of his entombment, as his supplies reached critical levels and he had begun to contemplate the very real possibility of death, salvation came from the most unexpected source. He was awakened from fitful sleep by voices, not the distant murmur of travelers on the road, but clear voices speaking directly outside the tomb entrance. His first instinct was to remain absolutely still, to hope they would pass by without discovering his sanctuary. But then he heard something that made his heart leap. They were speaking Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians, and discussing the hidden tombs of the region with the knowledge of locals, not soldiers. "This one here," an elderly voice was saying, "my grandfather showed it to me when I was a boy. The entrance is concealed, but there's a path through the rocks. We could shelter here until the soldiers move on." Marcus faced a terrible decision. Revealing himself might mean death if these were robbers or Roman sympathizers. But remaining hidden meant certain death from starvation within days. The codices were nearly complete, perhaps close enough that someone else could finish them if necessary. But Marcus realized he wanted to live, wanted to see sunlight again, wanted to share what he had learned in the darkness. Taking his chances, he called out in Coptic, identifying himself as a scribe seeking shelter, not a tomb robber or fugitive soldier. The voices outside fell silent, and Marcus heard hurried whispers. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, a response came. "If you are truly a scribe, prove it. Recite the opening of the instruction of Amenemhotep." Marcus smiled despite his fear. This was a test only a true scribe would pass. In a clear voice, he recited, "Give your ears, hear what is said, give your heart to understand it. It is profitable to put it in your heart, but woe to him who neglects it." The relief in the voice outside was palpable. "Come out, brother scribe. We are Christians fleeing the violence, seeking only shelter. We have food and water to share." Marcus emerged from the tomb like Lazarus, blinking in the sunset light that seemed impossibly bright after so many days in darkness. The group outside consisted of an elderly Coptic priest, 2 younger monks, and surprisingly, a Roman matron with her young daughter. They were all refugees from the chaos that had followed Philippi, seeking safety in the ancient places where Roman soldiers rarely ventured. The priest, Father Antonius, was himself a former scribe who had converted to Christianity but maintained deep respect for the ancient wisdom. When Marcus showed him the codices, especially the syncretic text attempting to unite Egyptian and Greek philosophy, the old man's eyes filled with tears. "This is God's work," he said, though Marcus wasn't sure which God he meant. "These texts are bridges between worlds, preserving the wisdom of the past for an uncertain future. You must finish them." The group established a temporary community in and around the tomb. The Christians had supplies, bread, oil, dried fish, even some vegetables, that seemed like a feast to Marcus. In exchange, he shared his knowledge of the tomb's water source and safe spaces. The Roman matron, Julia, proved to be educated and interested in the philosophical texts Marcus was copying. Her daughter, barely 7 years old, watched with fascination as Marcus demonstrated the art of illumination. With renewed supplies and the oil the Christians had brought for their lamps, Marcus was able to work with proper light for the first time in weeks. The difference was remarkable. He could see mistakes he had made in the darkness, subtle imperfections that his fingers hadn't detected. But rather than correct them all, he left some as they were, a record of the extraordinary conditions under which the work had been created. Father Antonius proved to be more than just a fellow refugee. He was deeply learned, fluent in Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He helped Marcus with some of the more difficult passages in the syncretic Codex, offering insights that came from his unique position between the pagan and Christian worlds. Together, they worked on translations that preserved not just the literal meaning but the spiritual essence of the texts. The monks, brothers Paul and Timothy, took on the practical tasks of survival, gathering food, maintaining watch, preparing meals. They had experience living in desert communities and knew how to make the most of limited resources. They showed Marcus techniques for preserving food he hadn't known, ways to collect dew that tripled his water supply, methods for creating light using oil-soaked reeds that burned longer and cleaner than traditional lamps. Julia and her daughter, Livia, brought an unexpected dimension to the community. Julia had fled Alexandria when her husband, a Roman official, had been killed in the upheavals following Caesar's assassination. She had saved what she could of their library, carrying several scrolls that contained works Marcus had never seen, commentaries on Plato that incorporated Egyptian mythology, medical texts that combined Greek theory with Egyptian practice. Young Livia became Marcus's most eager student. He began teaching her the basics of writing, starting with simple hieroglyphs that were almost pictographic. Her delight at creating her first characters, wobbly and imperfect but recognizably writing, reminded Marcus of why this work mattered. Knowledge was not meant to be hoarded but transmitted, passed from one generation to the next like a sacred flame. The tomb that had been Marcus's solitary refuge transformed over the following weeks into something unprecedented, a scriptorium where Christian monks, a pagan scribe, and Roman refugees worked together to preserve knowledge that belonged to all humanity. Father Antonius had brought with him several texts that needed copying, including early Christian writings that were already beginning to diverge into different traditions. Marcus found himself in the unique position of copying both pagan philosophical texts and Christian theological works, seeing the connections and contradictions between them. the experience deepened his understanding that truth was not the possession of any single tradition but something that revealed itself through the conversation between different ways of knowing. The work continued on the 3 original codices, but now with assistance. Brother Paul proved to have a steady hand and an eye for detail, and Marcus taught him the basics of illumination. The monk's Christian perspective brought new interpretations to some of the Egyptian images. The weighing of the heart scene, for instance, Paul saw as prefiguring the Christian Last Judgment. Rather than arguing theology, Marcus incorporated some of these interpretations into the marginalia, creating texts that could speak to multiple audiences. Julia contributed her knowledge of Greek literature, helping Marcus refine the translations in the syncretic Codex. She had been educated in the best Roman tradition, familiar with Homer and Hesiod, Plato and Aristotle. Her insights into how Greek thought had been received and transformed in Roman culture added another layer to the work. But it was little Livia who perhaps had the greatest impact on Marcus's art during this period. Children see the world differently, without the accumulated assumptions of adults. Watching Marcus paint, she would ask questions that seemed simple but revealed profound insights. "Why do the gods always stand sideways?" she asked, leading Marcus to experiment with frontal views that maintained hieratic dignity while showing greater emotion. "Can words be pictures and pictures be words?" she wondered, inspiring Marcus to create illustrated capitals where the letter itself became a miniature scene related to the text. The community established routines that balanced work, worship, and survival. Morning prayers were led by Father Antonius, but they were deliberately inclusive, drawing on the common ground between Egyptian, Greek, and Christian traditions: gratitude for life, requests for wisdom, acknowledgement of human limitation before the divine. Marcus found these sessions comforting, even though his own beliefs remained uncertain, somewhere between the old gods and new possibilities. Meals became communal celebrations, simple food elevated by shared company. The monks knew recipes that transformed basic ingredients into satisfying dishes. Lentils with preserved lemons, flatbread with herbs and oil, a paste made from sesame seeds that provided concentrated nutrition. Marcus's health, which had deteriorated during his isolation, began to recover. The bleeding in his gums stopped, his strength returned, and with it, the steadiness of hand essential for detailed work. Evenings were devoted to what Father Antonius called the Symposium of the Spirit. The group would gather in the main chamber, surrounded by the ancient paintings, and discuss the texts they were copying. These conversations ranged across centuries and cultures. How did the Egyptian concept of the ka relate to the Greek psyche and the Christian soul? What did different traditions teach about justice, wisdom, the good life? The discussions were never arguments but explorations, each participant bringing their perspective to the common search for understanding. One evening, as they discussed the nature of truth, Father Antonius made an observation that would profoundly influence Marcus's remaining work. "Truth," the old priest said, "is like light passing through a prism. Each tradition sees a different color, insists their color is the truth. But the wise understand that all the colors together make the pure light of divine wisdom." This image, light becoming colors becoming light again, became the organizing principle for Marcus's final illustrations in the syncretic Codex. He created a series of paintings showing wisdom as light passing through different cultural prisms: Egyptian, Greek, Roman, even hints of the Eastern traditions that traders had brought to Alexandria. Each tradition was shown as a distinct color, beautiful in itself, but the final image showed them reconverging into a brilliant white light that contained them all. The technical execution of these paintings pushed Marcus to new heights of skill. He developed a technique of layering translucent pigments that created actual optical effects, colors that seemed to shift and merge as the viewing angle changed. Using the ancient pigments he had discovered, combined with his own materials and some Christian techniques the monks knew for creating luminous effects in their illustrated Gospels, Marcus achieved something entirely new, an art that was simultaneously Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Christian, yet uniquely itself. After 2 months in the tomb, the political situation above had stabilized enough that travel was becoming possible again. The triumvirate's forces had established control, but the initial wave of prosecutions had passed. Former Republicans who hadn't been actively involved in the assassination or the Civil War were being offered amnesty if they swore loyalty to the new regime. Marcus faced a difficult decision. The tomb had become home, the community a family. The work could continue here indefinitely. There were always more texts to copy, more innovations to explore. But the codices were meant for the world, not to remain hidden underground. And Marcus knew that his companions also had destinations calling them, Father Antonius to a Christian community in the desert, Julia to relatives in Rome who could provide safety for her and Livia. The decision was made collectively, in the manner the community had adopted for all important choices. They would separate but maintain their connection through the texts they had created together. Copies would be made of the most important works, dispersed to different locations to ensure their survival. The tomb would be sealed but marked in a way that future scribes would recognize, preserving it as a potential refuge and repository of knowledge. The final weeks were spent in intense production. Marcus worked to complete not just the 3 original codices but also copies of key sections for each member of the community. For Father Antonius, he created a small book combining Egyptian wisdom literature with early Christian texts, showing the continuities between ancient wisdom and new revelation. For Julia, a philosophical treatise that would be acceptable in Roman society while preserving deeper Egyptian mysteries in its illustrations. For little Livia, a primer that combined basic writing instruction with moral tales from multiple traditions. Brothers Paul and Timothy had become competent scribes under Marcus's tutelage. They would carry with them the techniques for creating the special pigments, the methods for working in limited light, the philosophical approach to uniting word and image that Marcus had developed. The knowledge would not die with one person but would spread through networks of monasteries and scriptoriums. The preparation for departure required careful planning. The completed codices needed to be protected for travel, wrapped in oiled leather and sealed in cases that would protect them from the elements. Marcus created traveling sets of pigments and brushes, portable versions of the tools needed to continue the work. Maps were drawn showing the location of the tomb and its water source, encoded in a way that only trained scribes would understand. One of the most poignant moments came when Marcus realized he needed to create a kind of graduation ceremony for Livia. The child had progressed remarkably in her studies, able now to write simple texts and even create basic illustrations. Following ancient tradition, Marcus prepared a small ceremony where Livia would create her first complete page, a simple text with an illustrated capital, executed entirely by her own hand. The text she chose, with wisdom beyond her years, was a simple phrase that had emerged from their evening discussions: many colors, one light. She wrote it in 3 scripts: hieratic Egyptian, Greek, and Latin, with an illustration showing a rainbow emerging from a prism. The image was imperfect, the letters somewhat uneven, but the meaning was clear and profound. Marcus knew that whatever happened to the rest of them, this child would carry forward the essential message of their work. As the day of departure approached, Marcus spent increasing time studying the tomb paintings that had been his constant companions. He memorized every detail, every color choice, every compositional decision. These ancient artists had become his teachers, and he wanted to carry their lessons with him. In his final nights in the tomb, he would sit in darkness and reconstruct the paintings in his mind, a mental gallery that he could visit whenever he needed inspiration or comfort. The question of what to do with the ancient pigments he had discovered weighed heavily. They were irreplaceable, their creation methods lost to time. Marcus made the difficult decision to divide them. Small amounts would travel with him and the monks, to be used for only the most important works. The majority would remain in the tomb, carefully resealed and hidden, waiting for a future artist who might need them as desperately as Marcus had. 3 days before the planned departure, Marcus began work on what he considered his masterwork, a final page for the syncretic Codex that would sum up everything he had learned during his time in the tomb. It would be a cosmological diagram showing the unity of all wisdom traditions, executed with every technique he had mastered. The design had come to him in a dream, or perhaps a vision induced by the long hours of work in lamplight. It showed the universe as a great tree, its roots reaching deep into the Egyptian underworld, its trunk passing through the human world of daily life and struggle, its branches extending into the heavens of multiple traditions. Each level was illustrated with figures and symbols from different cultures, but they were arranged to show their fundamental harmony rather than their surface differences. At the roots were the primal waters of Nun, the Egyptian chaos before creation, but also the Greek chaos and the waters above and below of Hebrew scripture. The trunk showed human life in all its aspects: birth, death, work, love, war, peace, with figures that could be Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or any other tradition. The branches held the various paradises and philosophical ideals: the Egyptian field of reeds, the Greek Elysian fields, the Christian heaven, the philosophical realm of pure forms. But the genius of the composition was in how these elements interacted. The roots fed the trunk which supported the branches, but light from above also descended, nourishing the whole system. Figures moved between levels, showing that the boundaries were permeable. A philosopher ascended from earthly life to heavenly contemplation, while divine wisdom descended to inform human action. The execution required every skill Marcus possessed. He used the ancient pigments for the key elements, their unique properties creating effects impossible with common materials. The blue of the heavens seemed to pulse with inner light. The gold of divine wisdom actually glowed, an effect achieved by grinding the gold leaf with a crystalline material he had found in the tomb that had unique reflective properties. For 3 days and nights, Marcus worked with an intensity that approached religious ecstasy. He forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot everything except the emerging image. The others brought him water, ensured the lamp stayed lit, but otherwise didn't disturb him. They recognized that something extraordinary was happening, that Marcus was channeling not just his own skill but something greater. When he finally set down his brush, Marcus collapsed from exhaustion. He slept for an entire day, dreams and reality blurring together. When he finally awoke, The others had gathered around the completed page, studying it in amazed silence. Father Antonius was the first to speak, his voice hushed with awe. "This is not just illustration. This is revelation." The page seemed to shimmer with life, the figures appearing to move slightly when viewed peripherally, an effect created by the precise placement of complementary colors that created optical vibrations. The gold elements caught and reflected light differently depending on the viewing angle, making the divine wisdom appear to flow through the composition. The whole image had a three-dimensional quality, as if one could step into it and climb the cosmic tree from root to branch. Julia, with her Roman practicality, raised an important point. This page is too valuable to travel. It should remain here, in the tomb, where it was created. After much discussion, they reached a compromise. Marcus would create a simpler copy for the Codex that would travel, while the original would remain in the tomb, sealed in a special chamber they would prepare. But first, each member of the community would study it, memorizing its structure so they could recreate versions of it in their own traditions and styles. The night before departure, the community held a ceremony that combined elements from all their traditions. Father Antonius offered Christian prayers, Marcus recited ancient Egyptian invocations, Julia spoke Latin formulas for safe travel, and even little Livia contributed a children's song her Egyptian nurse had taught her. They were not syncretic in the sense of mixing everything together indiscriminately, but rather like musicians in a symphony, each playing their own part while contributing to a greater harmony. The distribution of the completed works was carefully planned. The original 3 codices would travel with Marcus to Alexandria, where his patron, if he still lived, would receive them. But copies of key sections would go with each traveler. The monks would carry texts that showed the connections between Egyptian wisdom and Christian teaching. Julia would take philosophical works that Roman intellectuals would appreciate. Each carrier would also have instructions for creating the special pigments and techniques Marcus had developed. Most importantly, they established a network for future communication. The tomb would serve as a repository and meeting place, its location known to trusted scribes and scholars. Father Antonius would establish a monastery that would preserve and copy ancient texts regardless of their religious origin. Julia would use her Roman connections to create safe houses for traveling scholars. They were not just preserving the past but creating infrastructure for the future preservation of knowledge. On the final morning, as dawn light filtered into the tomb, Marcus performed one last ritual. He created a small painting on the wall near the entrance, a simple image of a scribe at work, surrounded by the tools of his trade. But in the figure's eyes, he captured something of what he had experienced: the loneliness and community, the despair and hope, the darkness and illumination of his time in the tomb. Future visitors would see this image and understand that this had been more than just a hiding place, it had been a sanctuary of wisdom. The sealing of the special chamber containing the masterwork and the remaining ancient pigments was done with great ceremony. They used the ancient Egyptian techniques, but added elements from other traditions, a Christian blessing, a Greek invocation to the Muses, a Roman formula for protection. The seal itself was a work of art, incorporating symbols that would identify it to future initiates while appearing merely decorative to casual observers. As they prepared to leave, each person took a handful of dust from the tomb floor. This would be mixed with pigments in future works, a physical connection to the place where ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, Egyptian and Greek and Roman had come together in common cause. The dust was both memory and promise, memory of what had been achieved and promise that the work would continue. The departure was staged carefully. They would leave in different directions at different times to avoid attracting attention. Father Antonius and the monks would go south toward the desert monasteries. Julia and Livia would join a merchant caravan heading north to the coast. Marcus would wait another day, then make his way to Alexandria alone, his appearance altered enough that he wouldn't be recognized as the scribe who had disappeared months before. The farewells were poignant but not sad. They had created something together that transcended physical separation. Each carried within them the knowledge, the techniques, and most importantly, the vision of unity and diversity that had emerged from their time in the tomb. They were not saying goodbye but rather beginning the next phase of a work that would continue through centuries. Marcus remained alone in the tomb for one final day, a deliberate choice to transition gradually from the underground world that had become his home to the bright, chaotic world above. He spent the time in meditation and preparation, both practical and spiritual. Practically, he needed to transform his appearance. His hair and beard had grown long and wild during his entombment. Using his knife and bronze mirror, he trimmed them in the style of a traveling scholar rather than the neat appearance of a professional scribe. He darkened his skin with a mixture of oils and earth, making himself look more like a native Egyptian than someone of mixed Roman heritage. His clothes, worn and patched from months of wear, actually helped the disguise. He looked like someone who had been traveling rough roads, not hiding in a tomb. Spiritually, he prepared himself for return to a world that would seem impossibly bright and loud after the silence and darkness of the tomb. He performed a series of exercises, gradually exposing himself to more light, spending time at the tomb entrance adjusting to the daylight. The sounds of the outside world, bird calls, wind, distant voices, seemed almost overwhelming at first, but slowly he readjusted. On his final night in the tomb, Marcus did not sleep. Instead, he spent the hours in a walking meditation, visiting each chamber, each painting, each memory. He touched the walls where he had worked, felt the stone that had sheltered him, breathed the air that had sustained him. He was saying goodbye but also taking the place with him, internalized so deeply that he would carry it forever. As dawn approached, Marcus performed one final act of creation. On a small piece of papyrus, he wrote a prayer that combined all the traditions he had encountered. From the darkness, light. From the silence, word. From the solitary, community. From the many, one. May wisdom be preserved. May beauty endure. May truth transcend all boundaries. In the name of all gods known and unknown. In the service of humanity's eternal quest. This work is completed and begun. He sealed this prayer in a small niche near the entrance, a message for whoever might next seek sanctuary in this sacred space. Emerging from the tomb as the sun rose, Marcus experienced the world as if for the first time. The colors seemed impossibly vivid, the sky impossibly vast. The heat of the sun on his face was like a blessing. He stood for a long moment, arms spread wide, accepting the light that had been his enemy, too precious to waste, and was now abundant beyond measure. The journey to Alexandria would take several days on foot. Marcus had decided against seeking immediate transportation, wanting time to readjust gradually to the world. He carried the 3 completed codices in his satchel, wrapped so carefully they could survive a flood. But more importantly, He carried the knowledge of how to create more, how to teach others, how to preserve wisdom in the darkest of times. The road to Alexandria was both familiar and strange. Marcus had traveled it many times before his entombment, but now he saw it with different eyes. Every traveler on the road might be carrying precious knowledge. Every building might shelter a hidden library. Every person had a story that connected to the great human narrative he had been preserving. On the second day of travel, he encountered a group of refugees fleeing the continuing unrest in the eastern provinces. Among them was an old Jewish scribe carrying a collection of scrolls. When the man stumbled and his scrolls scattered, Marcus helped gather them, recognizing immediately their value: commentaries on ancient texts, written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. The old man, seeing Marcus handle the scrolls with appropriate reverence, began to talk. His name was Samuel, and he had been the keeper of a small synagogue's library. When violence threatened, he had saved what he could, but he was now too old and tired to carry them further. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible before his time in the tomb. He offered to carry some of the scrolls, to find them a safe home in Alexandria. The old man's eyes filled with tears as he transferred the sacred texts to Marcus's care, recognizing a fellow guardian of wisdom. This encounter set the pattern for the journey. Marcus found himself becoming a mobile scriptorium, collecting fragments of knowledge, making quick copies of important texts he encountered, teaching basic writing to children in the villages where he stopped for food and shelter. The 3 codices he carried became 4, then 5, as he added new works created during the journey. One evening, sheltering from a sandstorm in a roadside inn, Marcus met a Persian merchant who carried with him a text about Zoroastrian fire rituals, written in a script Marcus didn't recognize. They spent the night by lamplight, the merchant teaching Marcus the basics of the script while Marcus showed him Egyptian hieroglyphs. By morning, Marcus had created a simple bilingual glossary, a bridge between 2 writing systems that had rarely been connected before. As he neared Alexandria, Marcus felt both anticipation and trepidation. The city had always been a center of learning, home to the great library and museum, but recent reports suggested that the political upheaval had affected even these sacred institutions. Some scholars had fled, others had been arrested, and the future of the intellectual community remained uncertain. On the final day of his journey, as the great lighthouse of Pharos came into view, Marcus paused at a small shrine to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. He left a small offering, one of the reed pens he had used in the tomb, worn down from creating countless words and images. It was both a thanksgiving for survival and a commitment to continue the work. Entering Alexandria through the Gate of the Sun, Marcus was immediately overwhelmed by the sensory assault. After months in the tomb's quiet darkness, the city's chaos was almost unbearable. Merchants hawked their wares in a dozen languages, cartwheels clattered on stone streets, the smell of spices and humanity mixed with sea salt from the harbor. He had to stop frequently, finding quiet corners to collect himself, to remember how to navigate this labyrinth of human activity. His first destination was not his patron's house but a small workshop in the Rhodotus quarter where Egyptian and Greek craftsmen worked side by side. The owner, an old friend named Demetrius, nearly fainted when Marcus walked through the door. "By all the gods, we thought you were dead," Demetrius exclaimed, embracing Marcus with tears in his eyes. "When you disappeared during the Troubles, your patron searched everywhere. He even sent men to your mother's village." Marcus learned that his patron, Gaius Aurelius, a distant relative who had sponsored his education, had not only survived the political changes but had managed to maintain his position by carefully avoiding strong allegiance to any faction. He had preserved Marcus's workshop, keeping his tools and materials safe, hoping for his return. The reunion with Gaius was emotional but complicated. The older man was overjoyed to see Marcus alive but concerned about the changes in him. Marcus was no longer simply a skilled craftsman but someone who had undergone a profound transformation. When Marcus presented the 3 completed codices, Gaius examined them in amazement. "These are not just copies," he said slowly, studying the innovative illustrations, the depth of scholarship evident in every page. "These are something new. Something important." Marcus spent hours explaining what had happened in the tomb, the community that had formed, the techniques he had developed, the vision of unified wisdom that had emerged. Gaius, an educated man with interests in multiple philosophical schools, understood immediately the significance of what Marcus had achieved. "This work must continue," Gaius declared. "But not in secret, not in hiding. We will establish a proper scriptorium, one that openly embraces this synthesis of traditions." Within a month, Gaius had transformed a large villa near the museum into what would become known as the House of Many Wisdoms. It was officially registered as a copying house for commercial texts, but its true purpose was far more ambitious: to preserve and synthesize the wisdom traditions of all cultures that passed through Alexandria's cosmopolitan gates. Marcus became the chief instructor, teaching not just the technical skills of writing and illumination but the philosophical approach he had developed in the tomb. His first students were an eclectic mix: young Egyptians from traditional scribal families, Greek scholars interested in ancient wisdom, Jewish scribes seeking to preserve their traditions, and even a few Christians who saw value in pre-Christian philosophy. The curriculum Marcus developed was revolutionary. Students didn't just learn one script but multiple writing systems. They studied not just copying but translation, learning to convey meaning across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The art of illumination was taught not as mere decoration but as a form of visual philosophy, where images could convey truths that words alone could not express. One of his most innovative teaching methods involved what he called darkness training. Students would spend hours working in near darkness, developing their tactile sensitivity and muscle memory. This served practical purposes. Scribes might need to work in poor light, but also philosophical ones. In darkness, Marcus taught, one learned to trust inner vision, to work from deep knowledge rather than surface observation. The pigment workshop became a site of both preservation and innovation. Marcus taught the ancient Egyptian techniques, but students were encouraged to experiment, to find new combinations that created unprecedented effects. A young Syrian student discovered that mixing certain local minerals with traditional Egyptian blue created a color that seemed to shift from blue to green depending on the viewing angle, perfect for representing the changing nature of water or the complexity of divine manifestation. Word of the House of Many Wisdoms spread through the network established during the tomb community. Father Antonius sent young monks to study, and they brought with them early Christian texts and artistic techniques from the desert monasteries. Julia, now safely established in Rome, sent classical texts that were becoming rare in the East, along with Roman innovations in book binding. Even Samuel, the old Jewish scribe Marcus had met on the road, sent students with texts in Hebrew and Aramaic. The synthesis that emerged was remarkable. A single codex might contain an Egyptian creation myth, a Greek philosophical dialogue, a Jewish psalm, and a Christian parable, all illustrated in a style that honored each tradition while showing their underlying connections. The books produced were not syncretic in the sense of carelessly mixing everything together, but rather symphonic, each voice maintaining its distinctiveness while contributing to a greater harmony. One of the most successful productions was a children's primer that Livia, now a young woman and accomplished scribe in her own right, helped create on a return visit to Alexandria. It taught basic literacy through stories from multiple traditions, with illustrations that delighted young minds while subtly conveying profound truths. Children learned to write by copying maxims that worked in any cultural context. Kindness is strength, wisdom begins with listening, every person carries a sacred story. As years passed, the House of Many Wisdoms faced various challenges. Political changes brought suspicious officials who questioned the mixing of traditions. Religious authorities from various communities sometimes objected to their sacred texts being placed alongside others. Economic pressures threatened when wealthy patrons withdrew support during times of unrest. Marcus met each challenge with the patience and wisdom learned in the tomb. When officials questioned their work, he showed them how preserving all traditions served the empire's stability by promoting mutual understanding. When religious authorities objected, he demonstrated how studying other traditions actually deepened understanding of one's own. When funding ran short, the scriptorium produced commercial works, legal documents, merchant records, personal letters, that subsidized the preservation work. The techniques developed in the tomb proved invaluable during a crisis when the city's supply of papyrus was disrupted by flooding in the southern marshes. Marcus taught his students to work with alternative materials, parchment when available, but also thin wooden boards, pottery shards, even large leaves treated with special preparations. Each material required different techniques, expanding the scribe's skills and adaptability. One of the most significant developments was the creation of what Marcus called seed books, small, extremely portable codices that contain the essential techniques and philosophical principles of the scriptorium. These were distributed to trusted scribes throughout the Mediterranean world, ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if the House of Many Wisdoms itself was destroyed. Each seed book was unique, adapted to its destination, but all contained the core message: wisdom transcends boundaries, beauty serves truth, and preservation of knowledge is sacred work. The influence of Marcus's innovations spread far beyond Alexandria. Merchants carried illuminated texts that became prized possessions in distant courts. Scholars traveled great distances to study the techniques of synthesis and visual philosophy. The particular shade of blue that Marcus had perfected in the tomb, created from the ancient pigments he had discovered, became known as tomb blue and was sought after by artists throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the individual lives transformed by the work. Students who arrived as narrow specialists left as philosophical artists, capable of seeing connections across cultures and expressing universal truths in particular forms. Many established their own scriptoriums in distant cities, adapting Marcus's methods to local conditions and traditions. 20 years after emerging from the tomb, Marcus was an old man, his eyes weakened from decades of detailed work, his hands beginning to tremble with age. But his mind remained sharp, and his vision of unified wisdom had only grown clearer with time. He had trained hundreds of scribes, produced thousands of texts, and established a tradition that would endure for centuries. But he felt called to one final project, a return to the tomb that had been his sanctuary and transformation. Not to hide this time, but to complete a work that could only be done in that sacred space. With a small group of his most dedicated students, Marcus made the journey back to the necropolis. The tomb entrance was exactly as they had left it, the seal unbroken, the secret preserved. Opening it was like opening a door to the past, memories flooding back with the familiar scent of ancient stone and old pigments. The preservation was remarkable. The masterwork painting remained as vibrant as the day it was created, the cosmic tree still seeming to pulse with life. The ancient pigments waited in their alabaster jars, patient as they had been for millennia. Even the small painting Marcus had made of the scribe at work remained clear, a greeting from his younger self. But Marcus hadn't come simply for nostalgia. He had come to complete a cycle, to create a final work that would serve as both culmination and beginning. On the wall opposite his original scribe painting, he began a new image, a scribe at the end of life, passing a brush to a young student. The old scribe's face showed the weariness of years but also the satisfaction of work completed. The young scribe's face showed eagerness but also reverence for the tradition being transmitted. Around these central figures, Marcus painted a multitude of smaller scenes, each representing a different aspect of the scribe's art and mission. Here was the gathering of materials, the reeds from the marsh, the minerals from the earth, the eggs from birds for binding. There was the preparation of surfaces, the cutting of pens, the mixing of pigments. In another section, scribes of different traditions worked side by side, their distinct practices contributing to a shared enterprise. The work took months. Marcus's students took turns assisting, learning not just technique but absorbing the spiritual dimension of the work. In the tomb's timeless atmosphere, away from the distractions of the city, they experienced what Marcus had experienced, the profound silence in which true creativity flourished, the darkness that made light precious, the isolation that revealed universal connection. As he worked, Marcus told stories of his first time in the tomb, of the community that had formed, of the discoveries and innovations born from necessity. The students recorded these stories, creating a history that was also a manual, a narrative that was also instruction. These recordings would become as valuable as the paintings themselves, preserving not just what was done but why and how. The pigments from the ancient jars were used sparingly but decisively, mixed with newer materials to create colors that bridged millennia. Marcus taught his students to read the walls like texts, to understand how the ancient artists had solved problems of composition and meaning. The tomb became a classroom where past and present engaged in continuous dialogue. One of the most profound moments came when they discovered that other scribes had visited the tomb in their absence. Hidden in a side chamber were several small offerings, reed pens, small pots of pigment, papyrus with prayers for wisdom. The tomb had become a pilgrimage site for scribes, a sacred space where the act of writing connected to something eternal. Marcus added these offerings to the painting, showing that the tradition was already continuing beyond his own efforts. As the final painting neared completion, Marcus's health began to fail. He had pushed himself hard, working with an intensity that his aged body could barely support. But he was determined to finish, to complete the cycle he had begun so many years before. The last element to be added was the light source in the painting. Both scribes, old and young, were illuminated by a lamp that seemed to burn with unusual brightness. Marcus used the last of the ancient gold, mixed with a crystalline powder that created an actual luminescence, a glow that didn't depend on external light. It was his masterpiece of technique, a light that would burn eternally in the darkness of the tomb. On the night the painting was completed, the small community held a ceremony that echoed the one held 20 years before, but with deeper understanding. They didn't just combine traditions, they had become living embodiments of synthesis, each person carrying multiple traditions integrated into personal wisdom. Marcus spoke his final teaching, his voice weak but clear in the tomb's perfect acoustics. The scribe's work is never finished, only passed on. Each generation receives the tradition, transforms it through their own understanding, and transmits it enriched to the future. We do not copy, we continue. We do not preserve death, we maintain life. This tomb, which seems to be about death, is actually about eternal life, not the life of the body, but the life of wisdom, beauty, and truth. Every word correctly written, every image truthfully painted, every tradition faithfully preserved adds to the sum of human understanding. You who continue this work, remember, technique serves meaning, meaning serves truth, truth serves humanity, and humanity serves the divine, however understood. In your darkest moments, when resources are scarce and hope seems distant, remember that limitation breeds innovation, isolation enables concentration, and darkness makes us treasure light. The 3 codices I came here to complete have become thousands. The solitary scribe has become a community. The hidden tomb has become a beacon. This is the miracle of preservation. It multiplies rather than diminishes, grows rather than decays, lives rather than dies. Marcus passed away peacefully 3 days later, sitting in meditation before the cosmic tree painting, his eyes fixed on the point where all traditions converged into pure light. His students buried him in the tomb, not as an ending but as a completion. His body would rest where his spirit had been transformed, adding one more layer to the palimpsest of sacred history. The students sealed the tomb with great ceremony, but they left subtle markers that other scribes would recognize. Over the centuries that followed, the tomb would be rediscovered and resealed multiple times, each generation of scribes adding their own contributions to the walls, their own innovations to the tradition. The House of Many Wisdoms in Alexandria continued for several centuries, surviving changes of empire and religion, adapting its mission to new circumstances while maintaining its core purpose. When it was finally destroyed, its influence had already spread so widely that the destruction was like scattering seeds. New centers of learning sprouted wherever the scattered scribes settled. The techniques Marcus developed, working in darkness, creating synthetic pigments, illustrating philosophical concepts, synthesizing traditions, became standard practices in scriptoriums throughout the Mediterranean world. Books can still be found in ancient libraries that show his influence, the particular shade of blue, the way figures seem to move between dimensions, the integration of word and image that makes meaning visible. But perhaps Marcus's greatest legacy was the idea that preservation is creative, that tradition lives through transformation, that wisdom belongs to no single culture but to all humanity. In every library, museum, and archive, in every effort to save endangered knowledge, in every attempt to build bridges between different ways of knowing, Marcus's spirit continues its work. The tomb itself remains, somewhere in the Egyptian desert, waiting. Archaeologists search for it, following hints in ancient texts, but perhaps it's better unfound. It exists now more powerfully as possibility than as place, a reminder that in the darkest times, in the most constrained circumstances, with the most limited resources, human creativity and dedication can produce miracles. And so, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, remember Marcus in his tomb, patiently painting by lamplight, transforming limitation into beauty, isolation into community, darkness into illumination. Remember that every challenge contains the seed of innovation, every ending enables a beginning, every darkness makes us value light. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself in an ancient tomb, surrounded by wisdom painted on walls, holding a brush that can capture truth in color and line. You might hear the drip of water marking time, smell the mixture of pigment and papyrus, feel the cool stone that has sheltered seekers for millennia. And in that dream space between sleeping and waking, you might understand what Marcus understood, that we are all scribes, copying and transforming the wisdom we receive, adding our own understanding, passing it forward to futures we cannot imagine. The work is never finished, only continued. The light never dies, only passes from hand to hand, from heart to heart, from generation to generation. Sleep now, carried by the rhythm of reed pen on papyrus, the whisper of brush on stone, the eternal conversation between past and future that happens in the present moment of creation. Sleep, and in sleeping, join the great tradition of those who preserve by transforming, who save by sharing, who live by giving life to others. The lamp burns low but never extinguishes. The work continues even in dreams. The tomb is not a grave but a womb, birthing endless possibilities from the marriage of limitation and dedication. Rest now, gentle dreamer, held in the same silence that held Marcus, illuminated by the same inner light that guided his hand, connected to the same eternal tradition that makes us human, the tradition of preserving and passing on what matters most. In the morning, you too will wake to continue the work, in your own way, with your own gifts, adding your voice to the great symphony of human wisdom. But for now, sleep, blessed by the ancient gods of words and images, protected by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, cradled in the knowledge that what is truly valuable can never be lost, only transformed. The story ends but does not conclude. The tomb waits but is not empty. The tradition sleeps but does not die. And in that space between ending and beginning, between darkness and light, between silence and word, there is peace. Sleep well, modern scribe. Sleep well, preserver of wisdom. Sleep well, bearer of light. The eternal work continues in dreams.